thank you all for being here tonight. This talk is in conjunction with the current exhibition you see around you called Art Meets History, Many Worlds Are Born, which was curated by guest curator Ric Kasini Kadour in partnership with Alicia Inez Guzman in Santa Fe. Ric is from New Orleans and Montreal and is visiting us. There's a part 2 to this exhibition that will open June 11th called Technologies of the Spirit, and there'll be programming that goes along with that as well. I'd like to thank the 516 staff for all their hard work. Daniel, who's recording and live streaming tonight, Kevin, Claude, Viola. Am I forgetting anybody? And I'd also like to thank our very generous funders. We couldn't do any of this programming without their support. The lead funders on this project are the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, the Henry Luce Foundation, Lannan Foundation, National Performance Network, the Fund at Albuquerque Community Foundation, and the City of Albuquerque and its Urban Enhancement Trust Fund, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts, New Mexico Humanities Council, and New Mexico Arts and P&M Foundation are all supporters, so thanks to them. And our lead partners are the Art Meets History Initiative, which Ric directs, and also his organization, the Collage Institute, the Albuquerque Museum Photography Archives as well. So thank you to them, and without further ado, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement that was written by our board member, Roger Fragua from Jemez Pueblo. Albuquerque is currently built on the ancestral homelands of the 19 Puebloan nations that was shared with the Mescalero and Jicarilla Apache nations, the Utes, and later the Diné. Their respective ancestors, those living today and the unborn. The land always has been, is currently, and will always be for the winged, finned, and four-legged. I'd like to acknowledge the sacred living waters and rivers that cross this land. Finally, the sun, the moon, and all the stars and planets that keep our systems in balance. We welcome you and thank you. So thank you all, and I'd like to welcome Ric Kasini Kadour and Rob Martinez, and Ric will do introductions for everyone, and the artists will come up, so thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you for coming tonight. This is an oddly titled forum, panel, How Do We Do History? And it's also a bit of a misnomer because I think a lot of people think about doing history, they think about going into the archives and doing genealogy research or being an academic professor. And I actually mean the question to be much more broadly, which is how do we, us, just people in the community, do history? And I do think history is an action. It's something that we're actually doing all the time. And this didn't occur to me until I had this experience in the last kind of 18 months. I have a fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation to look at this intersection of art and history. And so I've been driving around the country visiting historic sites, monuments, history museums, and the big conclusion I walked away from was, wow, we're really doing history wrong. It feels like we're getting it, not quite getting it right. And then watching our civic discourse where we're arguing about history a lot, it feels like something that's worth thinking about on an almost meta level. So not thinking about very specific histories, but the idea of history in general. And to that end, some thoughts. I very much approach this work as a curator and as an artist, meaning not necessarily as a historian. And part of the reason for that is I like the bandwidth that gives me. Historians like Rob Martinez here has to be accurate and precise, and I get to be poetic and broad in my thinking. And I think that both of those are very important, but also puts me in a somewhat risky position at times. One way I've come to think about history is how history comes to us. And the one thing I want everyone to kind of think about through tonight is this distinction between the history and the past. That history is not the past. The past is this unknowable, unchangeable, unmutable kind of thing that happened. History are the stories we tell ourselves about what happened in the past. And those are always changing. They're changing generation to generation, and always being shaped by new information. And in that sense, I think about how those stories come to us. And I started thinking about 5 vessels. And I think some of the artists will pick up on this theme a little bit, but I'll share them with you. We've all read a textbook, right? And so we know about written history, where someone's written down the story. And that's one way it comes to us. But another way it comes to us, in fact, how those things are written, is often looking at the material artifacts of a culture or of a people, or even ourselves. And so if you think of it as, your great aunt that has that really weird ashtray of a poodle in a grass skirt because she once went to Hawaii, that ashtray, that piece of material culture, is carrying the history of her experience of Hawaii. But then she's going to talk about it incessantly. She can't stop talking about the one time she went to Hawaii in 1963 and met the king of Hawaii, or some guy at the hotel who claimed to be the king of Hawaii, right? And that is oral history. And the thing about oral history, this other vessel, is that's where we learn about our family. That's where we learn about our most intimate connections. Very few of us have books written about our grandparents or aunts or fathers and mothers. We learn that by talking to grandma, while she's cooking in the kitchen. And that's an incredibly important way to learn an element of history. So we've got the written, the oral, the material. The other two, I think, are underappreciated. And I was so happy that a number of artists in this exhibition picked up on this idea. One is the land. The land is an archive. We have the entire field of archaeology looking at what humans have done in the land, what they've stuck in the land as memory. But the land itself is an archive. The stories we tell about that archive, from the rocks on the land to the trees that are there, that's all carrying history to us. And if we can learn to see it and read it, then we have a completely different understanding of our natural world. And then lastly is our bodies. Our bodies are an archive. They're literally a history of who had sex with who, going back to the beginning of time. That's kind of fascinating. But in a deeper sense, it's also like, we carry disease. We carry predisposition to disease. We carry, clearly I've eaten well in my history, right? Our bodies carry our history, and we pass that history on to our children and our grandchildren and our descendants. And that's another kind of way of knowing history. And I think history becomes really exciting when we start thinking about how is this story coming to us. But that's not what I think a lot of academics do and professional historians do. Is that right, Rob?
Kind of.
Do you sit and feel your body and then do history with it?
Well, first of all, Rick, welcome to New Mexico.
Thank you.
No, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I like what you're saying. And yes, there's traditional ways of learning history and imparting history. Traditionally, we always have been taught that history begins when we start writing things down. That's a traditional way of looking at it. But historians are always changing their perspectives. We should always be willing to change our perspectives, especially if new evidence is brought to us. I always tell people I reserve the right to change my mind if new evidence is brought to me. And I think you have to have an open mind, or should have an open mind, if you're going to be a historian and learn history. And you also need to be brave, because history is fun, it's exciting, it's beautiful, but it's also terrifying and scary, and will shock you, especially when you start doing your own history. So, as a historian, you start to expand your perspective of, well, how do we learn our history, which is what you were just saying. Well, things that have been written down, that's good. But oral histories, which have kind of in the past been kind of looked at as, we don't do that, that's not acceptable as real history. Well, it is acceptable as real history because we all have them. Every culture has oral histories. The glyph writings, you see those glyph writings of the Egyptians in ancient Egypt, or the Aztecs in Mexico, that used to be kind of considered, well, it's not real writing. Well, it is. It's how they told their story and handed down their laws, their spirituality, and their the stories of their communities down to generation. I'm a historian. I was trained at University of New Mexico. I got a master's degree in Latin American history, but I emphasized my studies on colonial New Mexico to study not just what the Spanish were doing here, but why did we have brujeria, brujas, a belief in witches. I wanted to know what that was because I grew up with that. My family's from northern New Mexico. I wanted to learn about that. And as I learned, I found, like you said, there's family stories. My family would drive through northern New Mexico, and my sister and I would be sitting in the back of the car, and my dad would say, "Look, kids, this is Abiquiu. This is a town of brujas, a town of witches." And we're like, "What's that? What did they do?" You know. And then as I started studying at UNM, a professor of mine, Professor Kessel, he pointed out to me that there was actually an Inquisition document about an outbreak of hechiceria, sorcery, and witchcraft at Abiquiu, and had to do with the Genizaros, the Genizaro Indians. These were the servant slave class of New Mexico. So a whole world was opened up to me, not just about them, but about me. Because that's also my story. It's everyone's story. And I think that's part of the challenge as a historian, is shaking off those old narratives. You know, my family used to say, well, you know, your great-grandpa Felipe Lovato, he was a general in the Union Army. I did the research all excited. Turns out he was a private volunteer. Nothing wrong with that. But the stories change through time. But, you know, you talk about different ways of disseminating history and learning it. My father, my late father, Roberto Martinez, was a corridista. He wrote corridos, Mexican ballads. And the first one he wrote was about a soldier from Los Lunas, New Mexico, Daniel Fernandez, who died in Vietnam saving his friends. So he wrote this story honoring him, but letting people know we Mexican-American people of New Mexico, we've contributed to this nation. And he was honoring all the soldiers as well. Then he wrote a corrido about the courthouse raid at Tierra Maria in 1967. This is resistance. The event happened. My father composed a corrido. His group, Los Reyes de Albuquerque, recorded it. And when they captured Reyes Lopez Tijerina, they took him to the jail. And when they walked him through, my dad's corrido was blasting through the PA system. You know, history moving like a river. A river is living water. You know, it's constantly moving and changing. And so I think it's important to look at as many elements, as many ways as we can to learn about ourselves, but also to learn about other people. Because I'm looking at this amazing art here, and it's important to look at history and ourselves from different perspectives, not just my perspective. The old story is that the winners write the history, right? That's true. But that's not the only perspective. The people who are conquered and colonized, their perspective matters too. Mainly, we see men in the documents. Women's voices matter too. We have inditas. These are, that means little Indian girl in Spanish. We're not sure why it is. I think it's because it's a blend of Spanish, Mexican, and Native American musical forms. And they're like corridos, the Mexican ballads. But they are homegrown New Mexico music that tell the story of life here. And there's a subcategory called cautivas, captives. And they're sung from the woman's perspective. And I've done these songs. I've sung them. And I remember thinking, this is kind of weird singing from a woman's perspective. I'm a guy, you know. So I tried changing the words around to sing it from a guy. I'm like, it just doesn't work. This is a woman's experience and her voice. So I sing it from her voice. It goes something like, El año de 81, cerca de las 10 del día. Llevaronme cautiva y mataron a mi esposo. So you got to hear it from her voice, even if it's a guy singing it, you know. So that's another place, a source of our history, music, art. it's not just about looking at documents, which I love, by the way. I love looking at the old documents. I learned paleography at the Vargas Project in the 90s. I worked there for 4 years looking at the Vargas journals. But you also learn this is from a certain perspective, the Spanish perspective. You know, I'll have heated dialogue with people and say, well, you know, I believe this happened at Acoma Pueblo because the Spanish document says that. I'm like, yeah, but you got to read between the lines. It's not, they're writing what they're writing to save their jobs, to make sure that they can keep their jobs and they keep their perspective going. So you got to say, well, what was it like for them?
And see, you're onto something here, because that idea that we do history wrong, right, is that I think a lot of times people approach a historic site and they're like, tell me what this historic site is about. And then the historic site professionals have all worked it out, and they deliver this one singular narrative. And I was in outside of Marfa at Fort, I mean, get the name wrong, but I think it's Fort Bragg, but I don't think it's right, Fort Davis, because it was named after Jefferson Davis before he was the leader of the Confederacy. And it was really interesting because they had left out any mention of the Buffalo Soldiers or indigenous people. They were just like, here's a 19th century fort. You know, they don't explain why that fort was there, because that's inconvenient. And that site is actually working on that. I mean, they're getting better, but it provided they were very excited to show like 19th century Army hospital. And this is the thing, if you were interested in like 19th century Army hospital, sure, yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. But you have to kind of gloss over, why is this whole thing here in the first place? We're avoiding something. And for me, I started feeling like the narratives that are pushed, right, are always in service of power. But also, a lot of times, history is presented to us as a site of tourism, a place we can go explore, and it has to be, because it's catering to tourism, it should be fun and exciting, and often it's not, like you were saying.
Well, that's the thing, you know. Again, I love being a historian. I love learning. I'm always learning something new, and I love talking to other people with different perspectives. Even if I don't agree with the perspective, that teaches something to me about our community. But you're right. I mean, history isn't supposed to make us feel good. It's not supposed to make us proud. It's supposed to teach us. History is a teacher. We're the students, and we have to have open minds and open hearts. And believe me, we were talking earlier, I always joke, if you want to ruin your party, invite a historian, you know, because, you know, I can appreciate, I've been to Civil War reenactments. They're fascinating, they're interesting, they are somewhat historical, but I have been thinking recently, because of events in our country and here in New Mexico, is it really healthy to be reenacting that over and over again? And really softening it and making it more of a tourist thing, or even something like Colonial Williamsburg. I've been to those. I've enjoyed myself. You get the colonial bread and the colonial candy, but you're not shown the more difficult aspects of colonialism. It's never pleasant to be on the receiving end of colonialism, no matter what innovations are brought. I always what's his name, the artist here, Ricardo Cote? He does some amazing cartoons from the Native American perspective. And he shows a great one. It's from the back, and it shows a man with his little boy. He goes, look at this, son. Look at this, son. One day, none of this will be yours. You know? And he's making a statement, but he's also touching on a historical reality. You know, we want to sometimes justify what happened by saying, well, the Spanish brought all kinds of innovations. They did. They brought animals, horses, pigs, cows, sheep, apples, onions. But I almost want him to do a cartoon. He probably already has. I might subconsciously have ripped it off from him. But of a native person holding an apple saying, thanks for the apple. Now feel free to get rid of my language, my religion, and my culture. You know, it's like, it's nice to get some of that stuff, but it's very painful to be on the receiving end. And myself, as a person who descends from Spanish people, Mexican people, and Native American people, it's quite a dialogue, not just out here in the world, but it's a dialogue with myself. And remember, the Pueblo people, the Apache, the Diné, all these different people that were already here, including the mixed blood Mexican people, when the Americans came in, we got that too. You know, it was great to get some of the innovations. We got democracy and all of this, but we also were looked down on and had to assimilate or be forced to assimilate, and we resisted. Everybody resists. Nobody wants to be forced to assimilate. Nobody. You know, it doesn't matter what innovations come your way. And it wasn't, that's another thing, it wasn't instantaneous. We were conquered in 1846 to 1848, the U.S.-Mexican War, and then we had enough people to be a state, but we were told over and over again, you're not the right kind of people. We've heard the words, savage Indians, mixed blood Mexicans, fanatical Catholics, not the right kind of people, not worthy of the gift. So it took us until 1912, 62, 64 years. And you know, I try to change the narrative and mix it up though. Our African history here begins in 1539. When Estebanico comes with Fray Marco de Nistra, and he's an explorer, and he's the first official Spanish representative to the Pueblos at Zuni. There's a whole narrative. Oh, the Oñate colony, it's always called a Spanish colonization. That makes it European. It wasn't strictly European. There were mixed blood mestizo people. There were Mexican Indians. There were people who were, the term at the time was mulatto, but that meant part African. And that's our story. It's a complex story. We need to roll our sleeves up and get in there and learn the real story.
But there are two kind of big stumbling blocks that I think we should talk about before we invite the artists to come up and talk about their work. But one is this idea of shame, because I think we were having a conversation earlier, and we were talking about something I had seen online, where a response to a call to for people in the UK to look at British colonial history. Somebody had responded, why should I be ashamed of something that happened before I was alive? And I thought that was really interesting, because I hear that a lot. Like, oh, you're talking about slavery, you're trying to make me feel ashamed. And I think that shame piece gets in the way of a lot of people engaging with history. I also think it's a tool of whiteness. I think it's something that when we think about how whiteness is constructed, you've made me feel uncomfortable, now we have to stop the conversation, sort of thing, because there's power to stop the conversation. But I think that shame piece is really something worth parking. And it's, you had talked about feeling bad about history, and I believe that. Like, if you're only feeling good about history, there's probably something being left out. But I also don't think we're engaging with history to feel bad. Right? It's not about being ashamed of history. In fact, that shame prevents us from actually looking and learning that history a lot.
It should not be about being proud or being ashamed. It should just be about being honest. You know, I descend from some of the guys that were at Acoma, some of the Spanish guys. I descend from some of the guys who were encomenderos. They imposed the encomienda on the Pueblos. That was forced tribute, forced labor. I want to learn more about that, because it shaped the relationship between the Hispanic people and the Pueblos for generations. It led to a revolt, a Pueblo revolt. It led to a revolution. And there's even debates. I've had people try to change the name of it. They've said, it's the St. Lawrence Day Massacre, the Dia de San Lorenzo. That's the day it took place. And it's like, it wasn't a massacre. It was, from the Spanish perspective, from the Spaniards who fled, they probably said that at the time. But in historical terms, it's a revolution. It's a revolution, and perspective is everything. But it's not about being ashamed. It's about saying, you know, blacks were enslaved. That's part of our history. Why can't we talk about it? Let's talk about it. Let's have a dialogue. Let's talk, and let's be honest that we also have white people who descend from blacks. You know, that's part of it too. Is let's look at the real story and move beyond that and talk about the real history, the real relationship between the New Mexican Hispano people and the Pueblos and the other native groups, the Diné, the Apache, because we have to understand, things change and evolve. We're not frozen in time. We're not people in 1598. That's only a small part of our story. We're not people living in 1692 when Vargas reconquers New Mexico. That's part of the story, but it's a story that's ongoing. And we've changed. We New Mexicans, we are not those people anymore. By the time when you look at the records tell us, they're telling us something. You look at the census records and church records from the 1700s, 1750 census, 1790 census, it's showing that we're mixed blood. We're called mestizos, castizos, coyotes, all these different castes. Casta was a very racially hierarchical system. The people with power trying to control all this racial mixing, and they couldn't. They couldn't. But history is unfolding. Our Spanish is a combination of Old Spanish mixed with Puebloan and Mexican Indian and Genizaros. They're all speaking it. It's not just the people who were with Spanish ancestry who are speaking it. Everyone was speaking it with their unique accents, from their unique perspectives. And they're as servants in the house, they're raising the kids. Guess how the kids are learning to speak Spanish? And that's being handed down generation to generation. So history, like you were saying, it's not just something in the past. It's unfolding. We're living it now. Pandemics, controversies, statues and monuments. How do we use public spaces for public art? What do we do with it that feeds the soul of everyone in the community, not just one part of the community?
And that's actually a great segue to the artists. Because a premise of this show was that we invited a group of artists to come together and work from their own history to kind of create a contemporary project, a contemporary work of art that kind of shares a history of New Mexico. And with that, I mean, the idea is to find that complexity, those variations, those untold stories at times, or even retelling stories that are familiar to us. But I'd like to invite the three artists to join us up here and tell us a little bit about their approach themselves. One of the things that makes history boring is historians, and I would include myself in this category, when we start going, we can't stop talking because we're so fascinated and there's such a desire to share the story that we just want to keep kind of putting it out there. What is interesting about the artists is they were able to kind of take that enthusiasm and put it into kind of artwork that allows us to share it. And in that sense, they put it also into material artifact that will move towards the future. But we're going to move right to left, and I'd like to introduce ceramicist Margarita Paz-Pedro, whose work, Mano a Mano, is on the wall over here. And you started this project. I remember you found a particular photograph of women grinding corn in the photography archives of the Albuquerque Museum. And can you take it from there?
Sure. So hello everyone, my name is Margarita Paz-Pedro. Thank you for coming out. I'm Laguna, Pueblo, Santa Clara, Pueblo, and Mexican American. So a mix of New Mexico for sure. I was born here in Albuquerque, raised in Las Cruces, and I have family out in Laguna. And I've lived in Mora, I've up and down east. Actually not east, but more west. So looking at these archives was a treat for me. I've already been using my own personal photo archives in my work, so being able to look through these Albuquerque ones that encompassed all of New Mexico, I was kind of going at it, looking through keywords like Laguna, Pueblo, Las Cruces, and Albuquerque Indian School. And then looking through those, there was like not too much there, and or quite what I was looking for. So just opening up those keywords, and then deep in the research, seeing the image of women grinding corn, and really like being immersed. the way it came about was actually like it was like just before I was going into a dream state. It was like, okay, something came to me and said hands, and so I was like, all right, what am I doing with this? And then really looking at more closer to these images and the hands, and seeing a consistent trend that of labor, of women working, of connections and relationships, and putting that idea into my work. And then thinking about these photos and how to recontextualize them, because the ones I was looking at were for propaganda, were for a tourist point of view, not not necessarily positive reasons. So, and then what do I want to bring forth in my own artwork? And it was looking at the indigenous people of this region of New Mexico, so that helped build and shape it into what it is today. Thinking about the ancient pathways, the agriculture, the different artworks that we have around. So that's how I sort of looked at the archives and how it came to me in a dream.
Thank you. And that is, it's interesting because definitely with a lot of the material, a lot of the photographs in the Albuquerque Museum come from newspapers or periodicals or publications that were selling New Mexico industry, and they were photographing indigenous people for the very purpose of saying, hey, we have these indigenous people in the state, and aren't they cute? It was about trapping them in a kind of particular state. And I like that Margarita was able to kind of look through that and see kind of the other information that they're held. Because I think that's the thing about history, is that oftentimes it's giving us a warped view, and it can be really difficult to cut through and find those other stories and find those other pathways. And that doesn't negate the reality of how some of this material was generated, but I think it's about how we use it today and move forward. Next is Joanna Lopez, who is a sculptural installation artist, and who's going to speak about her installation that is downstairs, which is about Lópezville.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Joanna Keane Lopez, and I'm from here in Albuquerque. I usually work with large-scale sculptural installation, and for this work, I focused on installation as visual research, exploring my father's family land called Lópezville in Socorro, New Mexico, which is an old Spanish land grant from 1815 that was given out to about 70 families. And on Lópezville, it's mostly all abandoned at this point, and kind of these old adobe homes that are there. And a lot of my practice revolves around adobe architecture as a creative reimagining with the material. And on it, you can see how the original homes are these adobe homes, and then as time went on, it was cinder block and adobe, and then it was frame and stucco, and then trailers, and it just kind of got further and further away from these land-based traditions. And so with the installation that I have downstairs, it is looking at Lópezville as a looking glass into Socorro as a town, and also into New Mexico, as how there can be memory held within land. And so I brought in a bunch of dirt from Lópezville, and in the dirt is all these remnants from multiple generations. And in it is, it's mostly trash. It's like plastic and liquor bottle shards, just kind of showing the alcoholism that's also been in the family. And just so much multi-generational trauma that's kind of happened there, as well as nuclear contamination, radioactive contamination. So right next door to our family land is the New Mexico College for Technology and Mining. And in the 70s, they actually would do testing with depleted uranium. And depleted uranium is something that you put on missile heads to make it basically penetrate anything, and they would do open air tests. And my father, Damasio Lopez, actually worked as an activist against depleted uranium his entire life, and my mother and him actually met over these issues. She was doing a documentary called The River That Harms on the largest radioactive waste spill that happened 2 hours west of here on Church Rock in the late 1970s. So both of my parents were working on these issues, so I've been raised with very much of an awareness of the land contamination that's happened. And one of my father's earliest memories is having these bombs go off and seeing the adobe crack. And so, in a big way, the installation downstairs is this look at my family land and what's kind of left of it, because so many people have been either incarcerated or have died or estranged, or it's mostly all abandoned. And so I wanted to bring in the actual, like looking at land in all these different ways as actually bringing in the dirt, and then kind of deconstructing this process of adobe architecture and making adobes from them, as well as looking at different ways that people have looked at land through map making, either as historical maps, present day maps, or even the fact that Socorro used to be an old pueblo. It was called Pilabo and Tepana, and it's a dissolved pueblo now, and so that's a history of that town. As well as these agreements that I have downstairs, or actual, like these documents my father had, that are agreements to pollute the land with radioactivity. And so you were saying earlier that history isn't really always, it's not really that fun. And I don't think a lot of people really want to know about the nuclear history in New Mexico, but it's a very real thing. And it's really been known actually as the sacrificial state in a big way. And so, I mean, even the Trinity bomb was, I think, about 40 miles away or 45 miles away. And so this, I mean, it's a reality. And I guess I'm just really thinking about memory held with land. And when there is no stories left, especially from like really poor families, it's not like they were writing down their lives. And it's like, what's left in the land? Like these homes, the remnants that you can find, almost like this archaeological way of looking, and understanding what was happening in the town, and also as a bigger picture into what's been happening in New Mexico. And so, yeah, I would love for all of you to really look at some of them. I'm not sure if you have already, and check it out.
Thank you. And it's interesting, I think a lot of the artists ended up pulling from both kind of the historical archive, but also their own personal history, and finding that kind of reconciliation between the two. A lot of us don't get the opportunity to do that, to look into our own family and really think through those things, or it's something I think we do when we're older. Like there's very few 25-year-olds doing genealogy research when you go into an archive. It's usually someone who's in their 70s, kind of with the luxury and the time to put it together. But I do think that that's important work, because it's, you, Joanna, is always someone who's impressed me with like, this is who I am, this is who I came from, this is what my family was about, and knowing their history. That seems like a source of strength for you.
It's really actually been something to like understand, because there's been so much loss, and honestly my work comes from a place of loss, and trying to have like this new way of looking at it, and like how do I have like a creative reimagining towards the future with it, because it's never going to be the same that it was, you know, it's going to be something different. And so my father recently gave me one of the old adobe homes, so I've been like fixing it up and like working, but it's also like, oh, I don't necessarily want to live here, you know. Yeah, I mean, I go back and I check it out, but it's intense to think like, oh, this is like, maybe the water has been contaminated. They were doing it more up in the mountain, but then our property is just, it's one of the last properties to the mountain. Yeah.
And it's interesting your family comes from a history of protest, because that's an interesting segue to Marlena, who focused very much on the specific protest in 1974. And would you like to take it away from there? Yeah.
Yes. Ja, Marlena Robbins inishe. Ja, idina etati inishle. I think when I came into this cohort, I was looking at my own personal history with Albuquerque. And I grew up in Window Rock on the reservation. We moved to Albuquerque when I was about 12, and the majority of my adolescence was spent here in the city. Went to McKinley Middle School, Santa Fe Indian School, went to UNM. So I was really looking at first, making this like collage of imagery from Lotaburger and the beach and Dance, Dance, Dance is a teen thing. I don't know if any of you remember that, but, and like this like kind of goodbye love letter to Albuquerque, or like a toxic love letter. And we're going through the archives, and then everything that was going on at that time, all the political turmoil and the protests that were taking place, I was really intrigued by Bob Fitch's photographs from the 1974 protest in Farmington, and looking at the signs and the words that were used, which were so controversial and aggressive and very, I mean, you are on Indian land, or Farmington is on Indian land. There was one, if only Custer could see us now. There was, we want justice, and of course, slaughter the white man. And so that protest was in response to the murder of 3 Diné men by 2 white teenagers after they were engaging in an act called Indian rolling, which is when they lured intoxicated Native people out into the hills and beat them. And this particular incident, they murdered them. They bludgeoned and burned and dropped boulders on their heads. And the sentencing of those 2 boys was reform school, and they were released at the age of 18. And in response to that sentencing, the tribe, the people protested, and they started protesting every Saturday beginning in May 1974 in response to that decision. And they started boycotting the town of Farmington because the border towns like Gallup, Holbrook, Winslow, Farmington, Flagstaff all depend on the reservation for the people to come in and purchase goods, employment, food, gas. And so they started, that decision, the people came and said, you don't respect our lives, you don't value us as people, so we're not going to spend our money here, and you're going to hear us and you're going to see us. And at one point they clashed with the sheriff posse parade, and there were points of the sheriff saying that Native people were dirty and they were just a bunch of drunks. And so there's some verbiage out there from the sheriff it really sparked these stories about border town racism. And I had chosen these 2 protest signs and these 2 images. One is Farmington is on Indian land, and that I saw as a kind of a span of history, span of timing, because today there's the urban native era, and their slogan is "You are on native land," and it's become very popular. So it's a lot of land acknowledgement, the land back movement, and I kind of connected those 2 to each other. And then the other one, Slaughter the White Man, I didn't see it as being controversial because it was in my home and I created it, and I didn't see it as being, it was not a call for violence, it was just a sign for me, and my son saw it, my family saw it, and they're like, you're gonna get some opinions on that, you're gonna get some conversations about that. I was like, it'll be fine. And I think that it did bring about some uncomfortable and challenging feelings and emotions for some people. It did force institutions to take a look at themselves and how they're going to respond to controversial artwork. And I think that it forced us to take a look at ourselves and kind of deal with these internal emotions that either we're not acknowledging or not ready to confront, or doing our own internal shadow work when it comes to race and our own internal boundaries and what we're willing to acknowledge within ourselves and our own histories, our own ancestry. And so after I created them, the stories that came out from my parents and their generation, in the 70s, my mom, she was about to join the caravan up to Farmington for those particular protests, and they had an AIM camp in Blue Canyon, where all the people who wanted to protest would gather and start camping and start organizing and planning. And my grandpa came, and she was in the van, she was ready to head out, and he came and yanked her out and said, no, like, that's too dangerous. I'm not gonna allow you to participate in this. So she missed it. She was a little bit more radical and militant, and I love her for that. My dad, he, and I was able to record his story. He shared that during that time, the mayor was about to pass a new law in Gallup that would allow increased liquor sales. And they kidnapped the mayor. My dad didn't, but he knew people that kidnapped the mayor and took the mayor around the reservation and said, if you increase liquor sales, this is what alcohol is doing to our communities. This is what it's doing to the reservation. And I'm not sure what the outcome was but it was just, it's beautiful. My dad's not here anymore, he passed, but it was beautiful that I got to record him, and I got to record that story, and I can go back to it, and I can hear his voice again, and I can hear this story. So it's recording that history and those oral histories. My grandma, I record her. She doesn't know that I record her, but I love that we have this new technology where you just press a button and it'll start recording, and she'll share stories about boarding school. It's usually the same story over and over again, but I appreciate every time she tells those stories. So the oral history is very powerful, and with these two pieces, allowing participants to come in and bead with me, and I have a participant back here that came and got to sit with me, and they worked on the "You Are on Native Land" piece, while I worked on the "Slaughter the White Man." And we would sit together, and I would show them how to do this lane stitch. It's a very simple stitch, and share the stories about these pieces together. And they would share their personal stories of how they came to Albuquerque, where they're from, who their family is, who, what, when, where, how, why. And it was just this beautiful relationship, rapport that we were able to build through the act of creating and through the understanding of history. It opened up this space for dialogue and for connection, and it was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think that, the reality of engaging with history, as we've been saying, is that it sometimes gets really uncomfortable. And the tendency, I think, is for us to kind of turn off rather than tune in and tune up, really. Because we had a conversation about truth and reconciliation, Rob and I did, earlier today. And it's this other piece of history that we don't do in the U.S. that I think other countries do or try to do really well. I think Germany has tried to do truth and reconciliation. South Africa has done truth and reconciliation. In Canada right now, there's a lot of truth and reconciliation going on around residential schools. And I don't know that any of these processes are perfect, or that I would point to any of them and say, this is what we need to do. But that concept of how do we find the truth, how do we come to the truth, and what does that mean, and a shared sense of truth, but also then what does reconciliation mean? Meaning, what do we do with this really uncomfortable thing that At one point in 1974, a man felt he needed to walk down the street with a sign that said, "Slaughter the white man." And that is a breakdown of society that I don't know that we've ever come to a place of reconciliation with. What Marlena's work forces us to do is to return to that moment and say, okay, now can we work towards a reconciliation of this? And I also don't think it's like something we can do in the next 6 months. Like, we're going to reconcile on Tuesday in August. It's something more that we aspire to and work towards. The thing that came out of Marlena's work, some of our conversations were around protest, that this idea that protest is community building, that Marlena was seeing protest as she was seeing the old people and the young people sitting side by side, marching together and all that. And I hadn't really thought about, and having been in protest, I mean, I hadn't really thought about them as being about the people protesting, right? I think of protest as who's being protested against. You know, I come from an HIV/AIDS activist background, so for me it's always about, you know, the CDC or the FDA or the Health and Human Services, and, you know, we were protesting against that, not thinking we were just being out there trying to survive, because you had to do something in that moment. And this idea that protest as a form of community and survival was something that became really clear looking and thinking about Marlena's work. But also then I started thinking about, what does it mean to have to take to the street? And now when I see a protest, I'm much more sensitized to it, of, you know, what is it about the situation in our society and the world we live in that makes me kind of, would make someone go there? And then it gets weird, because I think there's a lot of things being protested today that I'm just like, okay, you're nuts, go home. And because people are kind of putting, but then the same practice applies, right? I fundamentally don't agree with someone protesting a mask mandate, you know, and yet I have to wonder, what is it that is bringing people to that point? Because at the end of the day, we have to live with them. And I think that's kind of the thing about history, is that you can say, well, I don't want to think about this part of history. The reality is that history is really important to someone else. And we are going to live with them. They're part of our world. And so we either create segregated communities, they're only people that we share history with, or we tune in, tune out, listen. So that's my, I'm done sermonizing, I guess. Rod, did you have any final thoughts before we open to questions and conversation?
Well, yes. First of all, my family's from Mora. Orale. I like what you said about our atomic history. I mean, obviously there's the obvious fallout, if I can use that word. But, you know, also the displacement of people to create the national labs. People were moved out of their land. Hispanic people, Native American people. Even at White Sands, white people were displaced to create this missile range, you know. And I love what you do with your art as well. You keep shaking things up. That's what it's about, you know. We got to shake things up, because if not, we become complacent, and then it's like that Lord of the Rings. We forget what once was. You know, truth and reconciliation. We were talking about that earlier. Who's against truth? You know, I think the challenge we have is we need to take a deep breath, all of us, and come to an agreement on what the truth is, because the truth will set you free. You know, it'll set all of us free. But if we can't agree on what the truth is, we're going to have some challenges. I write a column for the Santa Fe New Mexican on New Mexico history and culture, and I wrote something. And I summarized it on social media about our history, and a person responded and said, well, I don't agree with you. And I said, there's nothing to disagree with me. You can't disagree with the facts. I didn't put an opinion out there. I stated what happened. This is history. If I say I prefer chile colorado to chile verde, I like red chili more than green, that's an opinion. You can disagree with me. But if I say that the Spaniards imposed their civilization on the Pueblo people, That's not an opinion. That's a historical fact. Reconciliation, we are in a very dangerous place right now, and this is where we need to learn from history. In Europe, there was very unhealthy and malignant nationalism in the early 20th century, and it resulted in 2 horrific world wars that destroyed Europe, because in places like Italy and Germany and Spain, there was this unhealthy obsession with a mythological past, not their real or true history, and it led to this strange, unhealthy pride in nation. It's okay to be proud of your nation. If it's the sort of thing like, let's have a competition with other countries on who can come up with the cure for cancer first, or who could come up with the cure for AIDS first, or COVID. Let's be proud of those things, and then work with each other, not keep what you find and sell it to them, but work with other countries and work as a world community. And so reconciliation is what we're talking about here, through understanding history. And one of the ways we can do that is trying as hard as we can to look at history from another person's perspective. I get it. To some people, whether in the South or in New Mexico, they'll look at a statue and go, why are you taking that down? That gives me pride. Well, you have to also say, but it doesn't do that for everyone. And we need to learn that history is not something to be proud of, or ashamed of. It's something to learn from. And it's heritage that should be what we're proud of. That's what we get from our parents, what you were all talking about. Well, me too, what I got from my mom and my dad, and my grandma and grandpa, and my aunts and uncles. That's what I'm proud of. I don't know what to think about someone who was living 100 or 200 years ago. It's a little odd to me to say, I'm proud of my medieval ancestors in Spain. It's so far removed. It's interesting that I had ancestors there, living the best way they could, doing good things, doing not so good things. But I think that's part of what we need to do for reconciliation, is trying to understand why. It's not enough to say, that sign says, slaughter the white man. Someone could say, I'm offended by that. You have to ask, why were they holding that sign? To say it was a massacre implies that they just woke up one day and said, I have nothing better to do today. I think I'll kill some colonists, some settlers. That's not what happened. There was a whole series of events that led to the revolt. There's a whole series of events that led to that person holding that sign.
With that, let's open up to you. What are your thoughts, responses, disagreements? I mean, we could get into a bar fight about history. That's always fun. But what are folks' thoughts?
Well, I don't have a question or anything, but hey, Rob. I want to thank you all for being thoughtful in your art forms and in your curation and your study of history and your sharing of it, and just the courage that I think that you all have shown in your work. And it's important for all of us. It's important for our community to have storytellers like you. So,
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you all for all the different perspectives and medias that you presented. I went to Marfa, and there was just this large amount of puddled water. It was a waste. And my friend, who's from Santa Fe, goes, that's what they're fighting us about, and look what they do with their water. And, I was just thinking about the contamination, because the atomic and the nuclear and all of those elements, and not many people know by Wingate. I mean, they dispersed some missiles a few weeks ago, And there's all these hills. I went to boarding school by, in Wingate, and I have friends who still live there. And my friend posted, oh, the missiles are going out. And not many people know that those little bunkers when you're driving into Gallup by Church Rock, it has a geometric getting this trance or mesmerized by it. And I used to live north of Church Rock, but it was Springstead, and Alan Springstead owned this piece of land. And we used to ride in the arroyos with the motorcycle. Little did we know Kerr-McGee was just right there, and there was all this contamination and all of the materials that the Navajo people, probably not just Navajos, maybe other New Mexicans, that they built homes. They built homes from these nuclear uranium. They're all contaminated. The livestock were affected, the water was affected, and the cancers. My grandfather, who I never met, died from cancer. And so it's just this whole impact of, like, even Los Alamos. I think about, Martinez. A lot of the buyers were the people from Los Alamos, from the labs, from buying the Martinez pottery. Because every now and again, I have the privilege to be able to assist in appraising this work, and it's from people from Los Alamos. And there's Pot Chalet, who is up there. So I'm like already thinking that's a whole nother show, right? And a whole nother exhibit. And but I really appreciate the acknowledgement of, like, the contamination.
It's
you're
good.
like,
It's there, yeah.
you're adjacent to it. And Beata speaks about a lot of the contamination from Los Alamos and Llano. And just this whole state is, right there, Sandia Labs, everyone knows there's that fake mountain.
It's
there.
everywhere. Yeah,
You
there's a lot
know?
of tourists who are moving here right now.
Yeah.
I actually have kind of a wild story about Los Alamos. Remember when those fires were happening maybe like 6 years ago over in Los Alamos, and they was really bad? I was driving down from Taos to Albuquerque, and there was these huge plumes of dark smoke, and it was the middle of the day, and I was looking up from the driving, and I saw these like neon like colors in this dark plume of smoke. And I actually got out of the car and stopped and looked up, and it was like neon green, neon pink, neon yellow. It was just like these really bright colors in the smoke. And they used to put the big waste bins and bury them over in Los Alamos. And I should have taken a photo, but I mean, you most don't know because it's just these things that they didn't talk about. Even in Socorro, like, they didn't ask the town or like inform the town of what was happening. Like, yeah. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for your work. And Bob Roseborough, who was the former mayor of Gallup, spoke about that kidnapping. And I went to his talk last night, and it was at the Gallup Library, and he has archived photos, the names of the individuals. So I bought his book. I'm like, I need to find. I want to, he has archives in there, and he talks about the environment. He talks about the protesting, the racism, about border towns, and he's from Farmington. And so I just want to thank you all.
Well, and I'm going to wrap us up because I think we're a little over time. But, it occurs to me that you're a vessel of history. I mean, that the oral history you're sharing with us, these stories, and we all are. And I think we should all secretly record our grandparents before we can't. And because they don't know what we're doing if our phones are already out always. But I think, and that's the thing, right? It's that kind of doing history. Like, if I could send you off with anything, when you wake up tomorrow and you leave your house, there's evidence of history everywhere around you. And whether you live in a wooded forest or, in the middle of nowhere or a housing development, there's a reason all those things are the way they are. And if you think of how often we just don't know why this is the way it was, why this is the things are the way it is, and history gives us that story. Then you can geek out like the other historians and go from there. You had a question or comment?
Yeah, I do want to thank you for your work. Thank you, and thank you for a great discussion. Thank you, Rob Martinez. You know, something that's bothering me is we can talk about history and the different dimensions of it, how we do it, and what worries me most is who, you know, I remember in 1975 when Howard Zinn came out with the People's History of the United States, and it was like radical, you know, and you know, growing up in the Pacific region as a Pacific Islander, we were told lies in K through 12, and then you spend years going through therapy, and then you rewrite the history, right? And I think I'd like to get your brief thoughts on, you know, number one, what role do artists play in the formation of curriculum development in the schools, because a lot of it are lies. There are textbooks that are 20 years old that are still being used, right? What part do we play in developing a historical curriculum in the schools, so that, you know, a lot of the racism that we see, I mean, I look at K through 12 as a figure to blame in terms of why we have some of the problems that we have in this country. And, you know, what can we do as artists to change that on a bigger level, in a tipping point?
I mean,
is that too big of a question? Or?
Not at all. It's a good one.
Tag it, because I think I totally agree with you. But I also think that there is a need to change the definition of history to make it more relevant, more about my story, your story, what really happened. And I think that's happening. This group, I mean, thank you so much for pulling this together and insights. And my gosh, the work is amazing, all of it. But I think that we just need to keep doing this. And really it is about making it, instead of a capital H for history, making it a little h. And it really is a lot more inclusive than it ever has been, I think.
You know, I think the more we talk about history, the more we share stories, the more we make art about it, the more we kind of pique other people's curiosity. And the other piece of this is those textbooks from 20 years ago are wrong and they're problematic. And in 20 years, our textbooks are going to be wrong and problematic, because that's just the evolution of humanity. I think, you know, some of the best things we can do is raise children as critical thinkers, and so that they understand that whatever story they're giving them, whether it's coming from their third grade teacher or me or Rob Martinez, may not be the full and complete story. And there are definitely things I'm interested in and not interested in. So there's a whole bunch I'm not going to tell you. You know, there's things I'm not comfortable talking about. You know, I'm going to focus on these other things. And that's the thing. Every historian does that. Every artist does that. You know, every human being does that. And I think the trick is to find as many opportunities for engaging as possible, and also just being curious. I'm a huge fan of Ronald Tataki, A Different Mayor. He's been incredibly informative of my work. He writes about a multicultural history of America, and he kind of concludes the book, A Different Mayor, with this observation that history is not a set of answers. It's just a curiosity and a desire to question. And when you have that desire for question, you know, then you can kind of go out and inspect things. And also, you're not going to be fooled by Fort Davis leaving the parts out. Like, the best thing, I mean, the most fun I had was going into a place, a historic site, and then finding out what's wrong with it. Because, you know, that's just my personality. And it wasn't to beat them up about it or anything. It was just, I wanted to understand the complexity. And, you know, it's fascinating when you go into a historic home and they're only focusing on the 15 years that ex-former president lived there, even though that home had a life for 100 years before, for millennia before on that land. and had life, moving forward. But we tend to get those snippets of history, and the questioning is really fun. And the other thing I've learned is that historians love it. They love kind of getting hard questions. When you ask them a question they don't know the answer to, they get, most of them, not all of them, there was this one guy in Texas, but most of them get super excited because it's like, oh, you know what, I don't know that, and now I have a new thing to look up. And that to me means like there's all these people out there who are our allies, who are willing to kind of like engage with us. Please.
If I can say something. I think it's also important, if we're going to make the shift that you're talking about, that people from different communities tell their own history. I'm the state historian of New Mexico. I love my job. You kind of have to be the historian for everyone, and that means you make a lot of people happy and you make a lot of people angry. But I think women need to tell women's history. I'm one person. I can work really hard at it, but I have my biases. I'm a guy. I have a Roman Catholic upbringing. I'm Mexican American, so I'm going to have a certain perspective, and I try to have a varied perspective. But I think the different Native American communities need to tell their story. I want to tell Native American history. At the same time, I can't tell it the way a Native American would tell it, or any more than I can somebody from Socorro. They can tell the story about Socorro much better than I can. It's about that sort of, let people tell their story. Let's learn from each other and not just have one group or one person telling it all. I think it's important to have dialogue like that and have different stories told from different perspectives from different communities.
I think one thing that hasn't been said is the power of standing before art, talking with the artist, which creates a field of communication, as you mentioned when you were working on the two pieces, which is different than if you are advocating a position. What you're doing is you are explaining what you've brought out of yourself into your creation, and someone else is going to meet it from a different place. So art and artists, I think, have a little bit of a different role and a positive role to play in starting and keeping up and insisting on those conversations in front of the art.
Well, with that, did you want to make a comment?
Really quick, I do think that we had a really good opportunity as parents during the pandemic when we went into virtual school. Yeah, we're raising a virtual pandemic generation. My son is 9 years old. He's in 3rd grade. And so once the pandemic hit, I was his teacher. And I had to learn how to meet him at his level and engage with him in a way that he soaked in the material. I have a master's in American Indian Studies and Indigenous Rights and Social Justice. He was in my classes with me. We would talk about boarding school trauma. We would talk about the histories of boarding school. We would talk about our grandparents being in boarding school. So he was learning about boarding school history at a very young age. And I think that as parents, we have a responsibility to our children to have those very honest and very real conversations with them, no matter how traumatic or disturbing they may be, because our children are very smart. And if they're gonna learn it from anybody, it should be from their parents first. And we are our parents first. We are our children's first teachers. So I think,
So thank you, everyone.